Please. I have a child. I'm not a threat." The words hadn't even finished when a gunshot rang out. "She won't die," the man said, eyes fixed on her wrist. "We just need to vanish. Someone will clean it up." Blood splattered across the fence, and the man who pulled the trigger, he turned away, as if he'd just removed an inconvenient object from his path. But he had no idea. He had just shot and killed the mother of the commander of the United States Strategic Command. Where you live, does this kind of thing happen often? Watch until the end and ask yourself, if it were your mother standing there, how long could you stay silent? Gloria Carter, 64 years old, held a trash bag in one hand as she opened the gate and stepped outside. Her dress was made of rough, old fabric, with a silver-trimmed hem that had faded after many rounds of hand-washing. Her oversized, soft slippers made a slapping sound as she walked down the stone path. The morning air was gentle, the breeze light enough not to stir up dust, and the sunlight made the wooden fence seem less gloomy. Her other hand rested lightly on the edge of the fence, brushing against two lavender blooms that had just broken through the dry soil. She looked at them for a moment as if checking whether she had watered them just right the day before. "Don't bloom when Mama's not around," she murmured, then stood up straight. At the side of the house, an old plastic chair still sat in the shade of a tree, where she used to wait for a phone call that never came on time. Her son, Marshall Carter, no longer lived here. He had joined the military at the age of 20, then studied military law and rose through the ranks. Now, he was someone the neighbors only knew by name. "That older Carter boy works for the military or something. They say he's got a high position," but to her he was still the boy who feared the dark and would lie next to his mother whenever there was thunder. She had never asked what rank he held. She only knew he kept his word, calling home every year on the anniversary of his father's death, even if just to stay silent. Gloria looked up at the sky as if to confirm today was a peaceful day, but when her gaze dropped, a patrol car was already turning onto the street. The vehicle rolled past her gate, then stopped abruptly, its tires screeching against the asphalt. Gloria tilted her head slightly, still gripping the trash bag handle, not yet placing it into the bin. A loudspeaker crackled to life. A deep male voice barking, "Stop right there, ma'am. Show your ID." She turned her head, brow gently furrowed. "I'm standing in my own yard. Is there a problem?" The car door opened. Two officers stepped out. The first was middle-aged, heavy-set, his face unreadable. His eyes weren't observing, they were scanning, as if she were an object to be categorized, not a person. The second officer was younger, with neatly trimmed hair, his footsteps light, but his hand already near his belt where his firearm rested. Gloria remained still, neither stepping back nor forward. Her gaze didn't falter beneath their stance. The older man took half a step closer, speaking in a flat tone, like someone who had said the same words 100 times that day. "This area just got a report of suspicious activity. A woman walking around the house, no ID, no security cameras, and she's black, wearing a loose dress, wandering around alone. You know the deal." The last sentence didn't need volume. It was enough to choke the air around them. She didn't react, just took a deep breath, then spoke clearly, enunciating every word. "My name is Gloria Carter. I've lived here for 38 years, and you have just insulted me." They stared at her, saying nothing. The younger one glanced at the fence, where the two lavender blooms still trembled slightly. Dean let out a faint laugh, not out of humor, but disdain. His hand dropped to touch the cuffs on his belt. Then he looked up at Gloria. "You say that like it's going to stop me from doing my job." His voice was even, not loud, but soaked in a condescension honed by years of issuing threats that never led to formal complaints. Without waiting for a response, he stepped forward and suddenly yanked her left wrist. The force jerked Gloria's whole body forward. The trash bag fell, spilling broken glass and greasy foil wrappers onto the ground. Amid the mess, there was a soft clink. The silver bracelet slipped from her wrist, landing on the stone path near the foot of the lavender plant. She froze, looked at her hand, then at the man in front of her, eyes unblinking. "I have rights," she said, each word firm. "You are trespassing on private property." Dean leaned in close, his breath sharp with stale cigarettes, brushing against her face like a blade. He lowered his voice, but the words came out sharp as wire. Old black folks love talking about rights. What I need is silence. Gloria did not step back. She simply turned her face slightly, toward where the sunlight angled gently through the branches, as if to remind herself that this was still her home, still a place where calm could exist. Her arm throbbed in his grip, but she did not pull away. Her anger didn't rise as tears. It hardened into a silent wall across her face. Holt stood just 2 steps away. His hand hadn't left his belt, but his eyes had changed, no longer sluggish like before. He looked toward the roof across the street. There, in the slanting sunlight, a faint red glint shimmered, reflected light from some electronic device. Could be a lens, could be a home camera. He frowned, hesitated, then glanced at Dean. Dean didn't turn. His gaze remained locked on Gloria's face, as if every other movement around them was merely backdrop to the performance of power happening here. "One more move and you'll be sitting in the back of the car," Dean said, voice thin as a knife's edge. "Want to see how I write up a report?" Gloria still said nothing, not out of fear, but because she knew that any extra word right now could be twisted into a pretext. She glanced at the silver bracelet lying on the ground, then turned her eyes back to the man gripping her arm. "I taught school for 40 years, she said slowly. "I taught the first white child in a black classroom and the first black child in a white one. I know how to look at people, even when they're trying not to look back." Her voice didn't waver. It wasn't loud, but every word hit like a fist holding breath. Dean pressed his lips together, his grip tightening. But at that exact moment, from the rooftop across the street, a pigeon flapped its wings and took off, making the light from the strange object flash more brightly in Holt's eyes. Holt flinched slightly. No one noticed. He turned his head for half a second, unlatched the safety on his holster with a light touch, then placed his hand back, and just like that, he stood still again, as if the hesitation had never happened. Dean dragged Gloria toward the gate, each jerking step making the tiles beneath her feet clack with dry, brittle sounds. Their shadows stretched long across the old concrete, slashing over the patch of ground where the trash bags still lay scattered. Crushed milk carton, eggshells, napkin scraps, and a faint streak of blood seeping through the sleeve fabric. Dean's voice rang out, even and rehearsed like a pre-recorded message. "I'm ordering you to turn around. Hands behind your back." Gloria stopped. She stood up straight, her arm still being pulled, but her eyes fully turned toward him, steady with the same gaze she once used to keep order in a classroom filled with difficult students. "I will not give you my hands," she said slowly. "Not until I know what I'm being charged with." Dean tilted his head, jaw clenched. But before he could respond, Holt pulled his phone from his back pocket and opened the camera app. "Recording protocol," he murmured as if reminding himself. The screen lit up, the frame angled toward the street, enough to capture Dean in action but not close enough to show the direct contact between them. Dean glanced briefly at Holt but said nothing. He just tightened his grip. His face began to lose the restrained expression typical of routine low-level incidents. "You're obstructing a law enforcement officer. Under federal statute and state ordinance, I am authorized to use force." Gloria did not back down, though her breathing quickened slightly, her feet held firm against the cold tile. "You have the right to carry a weapon," she said, her voice lowering, "but you do not have the right to turn fear into a weapon. Not on my property." Dean didn't reply. His next move was swift and practiced, like a reflex honed by repetition or habit. His left knee drove straight into her lower back, forcing her entire body against the wooden fence. The fence rattled, old and chipped, paint peeling with each jolt. His right hand rummaged through the outer pocket of her dress, rushed and violent. His other hand remained at his waist, not drawing his weapon, but poised close enough to threaten. Dean's breathing grew heavier, not from effort but from a dull tension, as if this act had been repeated many times before, and he had grown used to the consequences being ignored. Gloria turned her head slightly, trying to face the man now inches behind her ear. She didn't scream, but her throat began to tremble, lips twitching slightly, half like biting back something unspeakable, half like waiting to deliver her final word at the right moment. The noon sun beat directly on the nape of her neck, where a red scrape had formed from the pressure of Dean's knee. Sweat gathered on her forehead, trickling down the bridge of her nose. But she didn't kneel. Her feet stayed balanced even as her back pressed hard against the fence. Holt, standing just a few steps away, gripped the phone tighter. The frame kept recording, but still didn't turn toward them. He looked at Dean, then at Gloria, then once more toward the rooftop, where the red glint flickered again. The silence stretched, suffocating, not for lack of words, but because everyone was weighing what might be heavy enough to break it. The old woman in front of them wasn't a thief, wasn't an armed suspect, wasn't homeless, and wasn't fleeing. She had just watered her plants that morning, and now she was being slammed against what used to be called a safety fence. Dean rummaged through her pocket again, his fingers brushing a small piece of paper smudged with ink from sweat. He yanked it out, didn't read it, just shoved it back like it was a scrap of worthless trash. Then his eyes narrowed because of the light glinting from the rooftop across the street. Something seemed to be watching. The silver bracelet flew out when Dean dug hard into her outer pocket. It hit the ground with a dry clink, then rolled slowly over the moss-speckled tiles. The tiny silver piece stopped exactly at the base of the lavender plant, between two young stems still stretching upward, bathed in sunlight that caught on it like a quiet spark. Gloria saw it fall. Her wrist was still in a tight grip, but her eyes followed the bracelet's final movement, the one thing she always kept with her even when just watering the garden, as if somehow it was a reminder that the son she had brought into this world was still alive, still out there, and might come back if he saw it was still being worn. "Get your hands off me," she shouted, her voice bursting up from deep in her chest. "I'm not an object." The words stopped the air around them for half a second. The iron gate behind her still hung ajar, its hinge creaking faintly in the breeze. A sparrow shot up from the eaves, oak leaves above rustling lightly. Dean didn't let go. He shoved harder, pinning Gloria against the fence so her shoulder struck the wooden edge with a heavy thud. His voice stayed even, like reciting lines from a manual. "You're exhibiting behavior that threatens an officer. I am required to restrain you for safety." The way he spoke made everything sound like a copy. No real person, no real moment. Just a script laid over every confrontation, as if skin color had already defined the level of threat. Holt stepped forward, still holding the phone, now lowered beside his thigh. He looked at the scene in front of him, then into Gloria's eyes wide, not from pain but from stunned disbelief. "Is this necessary?" he asked, voice low but clear. "I think there's another way." Dean turned. His face was blank, like a mask never meant to shift. "You want to get fired again?" he said. No one answered. Holt stepped back half a pace, not out of fear, but as if the words had dragged up an old truth he had tried to forget. The wind swept across, rattling the bits of paper and the scattered trash no one had yet cleaned up. And then, without warning, Dean drew his gun. The movement was fluid, his right hand lifted, weapon popping from the holster, trigger finger brushing along the side. A soft click, round chambered. All three chests rose with sharp, synchronized breaths. Gloria flinched and stepped back, her body still caught between Dean and the wooden fence. She raised both hands in despair, palms open, facing the man with the gun. "Please," she said quickly, breath tight. "I have a child. I'm not a threat." The sentence hadn't even finished when the gunshot rang out. Gloria dropped as if every joint had shattered at once. Her head tilted to the side, arms falling limply, blood spreading rapidly across her shirt, then soaking through the fabric, dripping onto the tiles. The wooden fence behind her darkened with red. The blood pattern sprayed unevenly, streaking from her left shoulder to her waist. The iron gate behind her stayed open, shifting gently in the breeze. Holt stood frozen. His phone was still in his hand, but no longer recording. The screen was black. Dean lowered the gun, exhaling sharply like someone finishing an inconvenient chore. "Call medical," he said flatly. "She's still breathing." But Gloria no longer saw anything. At the spot where the silver bracelet had landed, a small drop of blood slid along the edge of a tile and touched the root of the newly bloomed lavender. Gloria collapsed onto the tile floor in a strangely quiet pose. Her body didn't jerk, didn't resist, just tipped sideways to the left like a statue losing its base. Her arms were still outstretched by reflex, palms facing the sky. The front of her blouse darkened quickly, then spread downward toward her abdomen. Blood flowed faster than her final breath, tracing a red path along the grooves between the old tiles, seeping into patches of moss not yet dried by the sun. Dean stepped back. His face showed no emotion, but a faint pulse fluttered at his temples. He crouched, pressing 2 fingers to Gloria's left wrist. The pulse was faint, barely there. "She's not dead," he said, eyes fixed on her wrist. "We just need to vanish. Someone will clean it up." The words came, slow, low, as if not wanting to disturb the air that had thickened around them. Yet in that stillness they felt like something unnatural, half command, half self-reassurance. Holt remained still. His hand still held the phone, but it had been lowered long ago. He didn't lift it to record again, nor did he make any other move. His eyes stayed fixed on the woman lying at his feet, who just minutes ago had stood tall, answering every question with a voice steady enough to make 2 officers hesitate. Now she was motionless, her gaze drifting out, no trace of awareness. Her eyes remained wide open, not from surprise, but as if stuck in the instant before she could react, interrupted too soon. "You really shot her?" Holt asked, his voice strangely hoarse. He didn't look at Dean. The question sounded more like something he muttered to himself. In his mind, every past scuffle, every edited report, every case stamped closed due to lack of evidence flashed by. But this time was different. No one ran, no bruises to rewrite, just blood and a gunshot, clear, just once. Dean straightened. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and scanned the yard like assessing a scene. His eyes passed over the spilled trash bag, the silver bracelet at the base of the lavender, and the spreading blood creeping toward the damp soil. "No one's coming back," he continued, this time apparently speaking to Holt. "This place is quiet. The house on the left is empty, the one on the right's abandoned. Out front, if anyone saw, they'd be here already. So your job is to write the report correctly." "Correctly," Holt repeated, lips stiff. His hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the strain of a mind being pulled between trained instinct and something further out, something he once thought he could no longer conscience, or at least the recognition that something irreversible had just happened, a boundary crossed that should never have been approached. Dean stepped out of the yard, his boots smearing blood without pause. He opened the patrol car door, leaned in and pulled out a pair of latex gloves and a plastic bag. When he returned, his voice was rougher, more urgent. "You're right, she resisted arrest, struggled. I had to draw my weapon because her hand was near mine. No witnesses. She's still breathing. We leave before this becomes more." Holt didn't move. Dean looked straight at him, for the first time showing a trace of open anger. "I already saved your ass once, Holt. Don't make me choose again." Silence blanketed the space. The wind shifted, making the gate behind Gloria creak and tap against the wall. A small sound, but in this moment, it rang like a lock sliding into place. Holt finally tore his gaze away from the motionless body, but instead of looking at Dean, he glanced at the roof across the street, where a faint red blur had just flared up in the sunlight, like a reflection from a glass lens. Very small, very far, but enough to make him straighten up. Dean bent over one last time. With gloved hands, he rummaged quickly through Gloria's pocket, pulling out a small object wrapped in paper. He didn't care what it was. His eyes barely flicked over it before tossing it aside, like sorting through lifeless trash. He stood, pulled a notebook from his chest pocket, and spoke in a lowered voice as if reading aloud inside his head. "Put in the report. Subject resisted. Failed to comply. Object in pocket. Suspected to be a weapon. I issued a verbal warning. No compliance. Showed intent to reach near firearm." Holt still didn't move. His eyes no longer focused on the blood nor on Gloria. He looked directly at Dean and for the first time realized there was no person left in that face, only procedure, documentation, and a routine honed until it became repetition. Each line wasn't drawn from experience. It came from a habit allowed to thrive for years. Dean turned away without waiting for a reply. He got in the patrol car and started the engine. No lights, no siren. Everything moved quietly, as it had in all the incidents he had handled before, without ever being questioned. Holt took one last look at Gloria. She hadn't moved. Her right hand lay beside her, her left still twisted behind her back. Both of them exited the yard, the patrol car rolling out of the neighborhood as if it had never stopped. What remained was the bitter smell of gunpowder, blood soaked into the soil, and a beam of sunlight cutting across the wet stone steps, still glistening from the morning's watering. They didn't know that under the eaves of the house across the street, about 40 meters away, a digital camera was still running. It wasn't a security camera. It didn't belong to the police. It was a test unit, temporarily installed by the city's electrical engineering team to measure rooftop angles for worker safety. Its lens was tilted slightly downward toward Gloria's yard. No zoom, no facial recognition, but the frame was wide enough to capture the struggle, the hand gestures, the gun being drawn and the shot fired, all in full view. The camera was intended to test vibration range, but now it was recording its first footage not for calibration, but for confrontation with the truth. No one was operating it remotely. No one was monitoring it live. The device was simply carrying out its one job, capturing a scheduled scene, then syncing to a server via internal network at the end of the day. No one knew it was there. Not Dean, not Holt, not even the neighbor who lived in that house, still away on a 3-day work trip. And precisely because no one knew, the recording would not be deleted, not edited, not overridden. It would sit quietly on the server under a default file name, capture_test_unit45_1213_PM, until a young technician from the city's grid inspection team opened the file out of curiosity days later and nearly spilled coffee on his keyboard when he realized what he was watching. But for now, everything remained silent. In the yard, the lavender still stood, their thin petals tinged with blood, and Gloria, reduced to a cold string of lines in a report, still lay there, in sunlight, in wind, in a cruelty that had already been written. Gloria was not dead. She was still breathing, very faintly, as if each rise and fall of her chest was the last flicker of life clinging to something left unsaid. Beneath the faded cotton fabric of her blouse, blood had soaked into a large patch, but her eyes remained open, blurred and stinging, fixed on the pale light near the horizon. No one was beside her. No hand held hers. The wind stirred the grass slightly, but her skin had already begun to cool. Her right hand moved, slowly, as if each joint were being dragged across gravel. Her fingers followed the path of the tiles, brushing against the torn trash bag nearby. Part of it was soaked in blood, but she kept pulling, bit by bit, until her hand found a small piece of paper, crumpled and smudged at the edges. One corner was wet, but the writing in the center was still readable. "If I don't wake up, call the boy. Say, the bracelet has fallen." She clenched the paper, tucked it inside her inner blouse, as if she knew this would be the last thing that could go with her, the only thing that might reach the right person. At the end of the block, a car was approaching. It belonged to the neighbor across the street, just returning from a photo shoot. He opened the door, camera still slung over his shoulder, stepped through the gate, and paused as he set his bag on the steps. His head tilted slightly to the right, and he stepped back half a pace. In the yard across from his, Mrs. Carter was lying motionless. He couldn't see her face clearly, but the red spreading across the tiles was enough to knock every thought from his mind. The camera dropped onto the porch with a sharp clack, but he didn't pick it up. A second later, he ran across the street, shouting before he even reached her. "Mrs. Carter, what happened?" No one answered. The blood had dried on one side of her body. The trail ran from her chest to her abdomen, spreading into an irregular shape like a map of uncharted land. He knelt beside her, pulling out his phone, hands shaking. The screen blurred from sweat. The first call didn't connect. On the second try, he yelled into the phone, unsure of his own words, only remembering fragments like shot, blood, not moving. When the paramedics began unpacking gear and draping a thin sheet over Gloria Carter's body, one of them stepped aside, still holding her wallet. It was a silver-gray fabric wallet, old but carefully kept. Inside, along with typical contents like ID and insurance cards, was a small note, folded in thirds, tucked beneath the inner lining. No title, no signature, just a single handwritten line. If I don't wake up, call the boy. Say, the bracelet has fallen. She held the note in her hand, not folding it back, not taking her eyes off it. Her partner checked for vitals, gave a slight shake of the head, then tapped the device on her wrist. Deceased before arrival. Abdominal wound, blood loss leading to acute shock. The statement was recorded, brief and procedural. But the medic's eyes stayed locked on the note. She opened her phone and dialed the unfamiliar number written on a second card in the victim's wallet, an old business card, bearing a number not linked to any civilian exchange. The medic paused for a moment as if weighing the line between protocol and the right to privacy of the dead. But the look in Gloria's eyes as she was dying, if anyone had seen it, might have said she didn't write that note to keep it secret. The note was a key, and she had left it where someone would find it. She dialed, the phone pressed to her ear, the other hand still gripping the wallet. The screen displayed the call status. 1 ring, then 2, then 3. No hold music, no voicemail. At the 4th ring, the call connected. A man's voice answered, deep, expressionless. Only 2 words, I'm listening. She didn't know what to say, so she read the note aloud, exactly as it was written. When she finished, the voice on the other end exhaled once, then replied, understood. Secure the scene. Don't let anyone touch anything. Then the call ended. No, I'll be there. No, asking the victim's name. No confirmation of address, time, or condition. Just 6 seconds. 6 seconds. Enough for the one listening to understand, and enough for the one calling to feel that something had just shifted in a way she could not explain. She looked down at her phone screen. The call had ended. Time-stamped. 6 seconds. 6 seconds of a response that didn't belong to medical protocol and carried none of the familiar tone of a victim's relative. That voice didn't shake, didn't hesitate. It sounded like an order, someone used to giving them, and always having them followed. She stood quietly in front of the house where the trellis flowers had yet to be fully watered. Blood still marked the ground in patches that had not dried. The silver bracelet she had retrieved while checking the victim's belongings still sat in the first aid kit, but now she no longer dared to touch it. A few minutes later, a local police cruiser arrived, but the officers did not step onto the scene. They waited. No one knew why, but everyone could sense something was not to be disturbed yet. The medic returned to her partner and said, "We're not moving her. Someone's on their way. They want the scene untouched." Her colleague nodded, asking no questions. They raised a temporary barrier with a strip of yellow fabric, stretching it from the gate to the porch. The atmosphere began to sink in that particular way seasoned medics recognized this was no longer just a civilian death. In that lull, the wind blew again across the roof of the house opposite. The camera still sat in its corner. The red light continued blinking, recording every step, every glance, every minute of waiting in a case not yet acknowledged as one. The tiles still bore the footprint of the 2 officers. Gloria lay on her side, her head tilted slightly toward the light. A breeze lifted the edge of her blouse, revealing part of her thin arm. Beneath it was soil she had loosened earlier that morning, just to check if the roots of her flowers were still alive. In the haze between life and death, no one heard her last thoughts. But if one could step into that moment, the final second when her hand reached for the note, when her mind was no longer fully clear, perhaps the only thing she wondered was whether her son would have enough time to know this had happened. She didn't think of injustice. She didn't think of the bullet. She thought about the silver bracelet that had fallen. That small item was a gift from her son the first year he joined the military. It held no monetary value, but it was their only sign, something like the way animals recognize each other in the dark, wordless, unquestioned. She had once wondered if the day came when she collapsed alone, with no one nearby, no camera, no witness, would anything be clear enough for her son to know this shouldn't be ignored? And so, she wrote the note, quietly, not certain it would be found. But it was all she could do, knowing that the only thing that could resist vanishing was a message shorter than a single verse. Now, the call had been made. The voice had answered, and someone, somewhere, hundreds of miles away, had likely turned their head in the direction that instinct pointed. No questions were asked. In this field, sometimes the briefest commands carry the kind of weight that forces an entire system to halt. They reinforce the perimeter, raise the barrier higher, and pulled the measuring equipment back behind the yard. Everything entered a state of pause. A helicopter passed far above the sky at that moment. Very far. No one knew if it was connected, but among the trees, the wind shifted, and one lavender bloom leaned sideways, gently brushing the silver bracelet lying between two stones. From above, the sound of the helicopter slicing through sun-drenched tree branches echoed across a neighborhood rarely visited by low-flying military aircraft. There was no loudspeaker, no recognizable rescue or media insignia. The charcoal-gray UH-60 turned in a single, silent loop, as if confirming coordinates. Then it veered off abruptly, without landing, leaving behind an empty hush in the air that made those standing by the yellow barricade glance at each other, unsure what exactly they were supposed to be waiting for. 12 minutes later, a black SUV turned into the street, moving straight and slow, without sirens. When it stopped, the man in the back seat didn't immediately open the door. He pushed it open gently with his right hand and stepped out with a posture that needed no command. He wore a white buttoned-up shirt, a deep gray coat, and neatly pressed trousers, everything so precise that no crease appeared accidental. In the slanting light, his face remained partly obscured, but his walk was unmistakable, calm, measured. Each step weighted like he was walking across tiled stone, in rhythm with a place that once knew him. The medic standing near the edge of the tarp barrier stepped aside the moment his gaze met hers. No signal was given. She looked at him for just 1 second, then slid the tarp open, clearing the path into the yard. He stepped into the small courtyard where Gloria still lay, her right arm across her chest, her head tilted toward the lavender that had wilted in the heat. One bloom had bent downward, brushing gently against the nearby bloodstain, as if bowing in place of someone who had not arrived in time. No one on the medical team needed to be told why all action had stopped. The man's presence was its unspoken order, carrying authority beyond any handbook, and they were right. His name was Marshal Carter, commander of the United States Strategic Command, a role overseeing global deterrence capabilities and intelligence coordination, a man with the power to call any cabinet secretary out of bed at midnight, and, when necessary, order the entire law enforcement apparatus to halt until further instruction. But today he had not come with power. He had come because of a 6-second call, enough to pull him from an emergency military briefing. Gloria Carter was his mother, the woman who once taught him how to say, "I'm sorry," at the right moment. Not to escape punishment, but to keep himself from becoming lawfully cruel. The woman who took him to the enlistment bus stop on that July day, borrowing a neighbor's white shirt for him to wear because she didn't want to send off a boy. She wanted to send a man who knew how to hold himself right. Now she lay there in the sunlit courtyard, in a silence that should never have existed. Marshal Carter knelt, one hand placed on a tile beside the edge of his mother's blouse, eyes unblinking. And within seconds of his knees touching the ground, the entire neighborhood held its breath. He remained still beside the body, as if time itself had paused here, just for him. His eyes were not fixed on the blood, nor did they avoid the sight of his mother lying there. He looked straight ahead, made no reflexive gestures, and didn't bow his head. He simply observed. Then he quietly stepped toward the medical tray where the silver bracelet had been placed. It rested among cotton pads, gloves, and surgical scissors, out of place and dulled under the sterile gleam. Still, he recognized it instantly. A small, thin bracelet, once scratched on the inside edge from bumping the wooden kitchen chair. She had once laughed and said, "The scratch makes it real." Marshall picked it up. A dark smear of dried blood clung to the underside. He didn't raise it to inspect, didn't need to examine. He simply pulled a handkerchief from his coat pocket and cleaned it slowly, using the softest part of the cloth. His hand moved steadily, firm enough to erase the blood, gentle enough not to hurt what the bracelet still meant. When the last trace of blood was gone, he lowered himself beside his mother again. The wind passed through, carrying the scent of dried blood and barely living grass. The late afternoon light fell across his back, casting a long shadow that reached over her head, like an invisible arm shielding her too late. He gently placed the bracelet back on her left wrist, the same place she had worn it for over 20 years without ever taking it off. His fingers adjusted the clasp, turning it inward, just the way she always preferred, so no one could see the engraved name. In that moment, he did not cry, not because he wasn't grieving, but because some losses do not flow as tears. They settle as weight in the chest, as emptiness no breath can fill. He looked at her hand, palm slightly open, curved as if still holding something, perhaps the lavender stem she had just planted, or a memory she had not yet passed on. Marshall drew in a long breath. His face held the same composure that once quieted entire national briefings, but this time his voice wasn't aimed at the government or military. It was directed toward the ground. Mom once said, "Justice doesn't live in speeches." He paused. "It lives in how someone dies, and whether others dare to name it." The words were not loud, but clear enough that the nurse outside the tarp heard every syllable. She turned her face away, but her throat tightened. To those unfamiliar with him, it might have sounded like a eulogy, but to those who had worked with Marshall Carter, they knew any sentence that left his mouth was never just descriptive, it was catalytic. And when he used the phrase "whether others dare to name it," it wasn't a metaphor, it was a signal. He stood up, brushed the dust from his knees, and never looked away from his mother again. He didn't kiss her forehead, didn't close her eyes. She had once told him, "When I'm gone, don't act like I need a farewell. Just decide whether what I taught you is worth keeping." He nodded to someone who could no longer hear. Then he turned away, just as the wind rose once more. The oak tree at the edge of the yard cast a soft shadow over the ground, making the silver bracelet on her wrist glint faintly, like a thin blade drawn inward to the heart of a man who had once protected a nation, but never imagined he'd have to protect his mother. On the third floor of the local police department, 4 ceiling fans spun out of sync. The air was thick and slow, as if every decision made in this building needed to be molded before it could be written down. Fluorescent lights cast a pale greenish glow over the desk surfaces, turning even paper documents cold to the touch. Dean sat at the central desk, pen in hand, eyes locked on the unfinished report. The first page read, "Emergency Incident Report. Event occurred at residence number 1134 Laverne neighborhood." He skimmed the date line, double-checked the time column, then began writing sentence by sentence, in dry, even handwriting devoid of emotion. Female subject, estimated over 60 years old, black, long-term resident of the neighborhood. During routine patrol, suspicious activity was observed when the subject approached the fence in a crouched position. When asked for identification, the subject did not comply, appeared to step back and turn away. Officer Dean Mathers proceeded with the preventive engagement protocol. During the search of personal belongings, the subject forcefully pulled away, showing signs of obstructing duty. An unknown item was discovered in the subject's coat pocket, suspected to pose a potential threat. Officer Mathers issued a verbal warning. Due to continued resistance, the officer was compelled to draw his firearm and discharge his weapon under emergency threat conditions to protect himself and his partner. No witnesses present. No recording devices were detected at the incident site. Case processed under protocol, neighborhood-level use of force, no escalation required. Dean put down the pen and leaned back in his chair. He looked across at Holt, sitting opposite him under the harsh circle of light. "Your turn," Dean said. sliding the paper forward. "Just sign." Holt picked up the pen, holding it between his fingers for a moment. Blue ink. The watermark of the police department at the top was so crisp it seemed to want to say something else entirely. But the document remained silent. He looked down at the statement, each word pushed back against his chest. The details, forcefully pulled, objects suspected to be a weapon, were lies, and he knew it. Gloria Carter had stood still, carrying nothing but a trash bag, a wallet, and a silver bracelet that had fallen quietly to the ground. Dean didn't push, he just stared at Holt, as if that alone could pull someone toward a signature. Holt's lips parted, but no words came out. In the end, he lowered his eyes and signed. The ink soaked into the page. No sound followed. But inside Holt's head, it echoed like a gouge carved deep into something he once hoped he wouldn't lose. Dean nodded. "Good. The rest will be handled." And it was. 1 hour later, the report was stamped. 40 minutes after that, the department's administrative secretary issued an internal memo. "Incident at Laverne neighborhood. Internal handling only. No press briefing required. Label as neighborhood-level resolution. Avoid media contact." And so, no news segment aired. The local station opted to cover a highway truck theft. The regional paper led with headlines about the summer festival at the Southern Church. In the statewide event monitoring system, no one entered the identification code for the Gloria Carter case because it didn't cross the threat threshold. Her death was filed under incident with significant consequence, special conditions present, no criminal case required. The story closed on paper, but outside, in the hallway on the 3rd floor, Holt stood alone by a half-open window, looking down at the neighborhood below. A civilian helicopter had just passed, growing smaller against a windless sky. He watched it disappear, a question echoing in his mind that he didn't dare say aloud. If someone saw this, would the system ever expose itself, or would it remain silent? Because too many had signed without ever having to apologize. 3 days later, near the end of the workday, in a small technical branch of the city's public works department, a young employee was reviewing footage from various test cameras installed across rooftops in the Laverne neighborhood. It was routine post-check work, mostly ignored by others, meant to ensure camera stability, proper framing, and no blind spots for rooftop crews. His name was Elias Moore, 29 years old. A software engineer in the purest sense, he worked with algorithms, not law enforcement, and certainly nothing involving blood. Elias's job was simple: scan video tests, verify light handling, edge detection, and frame stability. Each week he processed hundreds of files. Most showed birds in flight, tilting trees, or cats jumping from wall to roof. That day's file carried a default name: Apture_test_unit 45_1213_PM, MP4. He nearly deleted it, since the timestamp coincided with a known power outage across part of Laverne, usually meaning a blank or blurred image. But when he scrubbed the footage to minute 32, Elias sat up straight. In the frame, angled at 30 degrees from the eaves of the house across the street, an older woman stood in a yard, wearing a long dress. A police officer approached and grabbed her arm. Something small and round fell to the ground. Then came a struggle. A second officer appeared. There were gestures, no audio, but enough facial expressions to read the panic. Then the gun was drawn. A flash, the woman collapsed. Elias raised a hand to his mouth, eyes locked on the screen. He replayed it. Again, clear visuals of spreading blood, the metallic glint of the weapon, hands raised, no signs of resistance, no object of concern, just a person treated as if her presence was the violation. Below the screen was the export button. He hovered the mouse over it, hesitated. His palm was sweating. It slipped slightly. Then he typed a small note beneath the video window. Location 1134 Laverne. Footage recorded at 12:13 p.m. The officer discharged a weapon at an unarmed civilian. Critical incident. Then he clicked Export. The file was compressed. The system moved to a temporary storage interface. A backup was synced into the department's internal network, where technical videos underwent a final review before weekend audits. Elias told no one, but minutes later, a colleague performing internal checks opened the duplicate file because it was flagged urgent with a red Hupp note. She watched for less than 10 seconds before pulling out her headphones, turning to Elias, and asking one question. "Is this real?" Elias nodded slowly. His lips trembled. "Test cam from Block G, 3 days ago. No one knows yet." She said nothing more. But within an hour, the footage was added to the city's anomalous materials review queue. Within 12 more hours, the file was re-uploaded anonymously to a private infrastructure platform used by municipal engineers, independent of the police, outside military jurisdiction, beyond media filters. From that platform, the video would be shared by another engineer whose brother happened to be a civil liberties attorney. And from there, a spiral began. A spiral Dean Mathers had never planned for, because he had believed one thing above all: no witnesses, no camera. But some devices were not installed to watch people. They were installed to record perspective. And this time, that perspective captured the truth, uncut, unfiltered, and beyond control. The video was first shared on Wednesday morning by an unidentified account with a simple caption, 1134 Laverne. Don't let this truth be erased again. The clip lasted only 30 seconds from the moment Gloria Carter's arm was yanked to the instant the gun flashed and her body fell. No words were spoken in the footage, but by afternoon it reappeared in another version, this time with narration. The voice was not angry, but soft, slow, and hoarse, as if each sentence had to push through a layer of ash in the throat. The woman in the video is Gloria Carter. She lived here for 38 years. She was shot while standing in her yard, next to a trash bag and 2 newly planted lavender flowers. At the end of the clip, an image of the silver bracelet was shown, lying between 2 bricks beside a deep red blood stain not yet dried. Below the video, for the first time, a bold purple caption appeared, "Lavender Blood." No one knew who first wrote it, but within 6 hours the hashtag had appeared more than 10,000 times across the city's internal social network. Every post came with a photo, an old bracelet, a blood-stained wooden fence, or a wilted purple flower. One account named Sharon_M, an elementary school teacher, posted a photo taken from across Mrs. Carter's yard, along with the caption, "I used to pass this house every week. He always sat by the door peeling apples for neighborhood kids. The blood is still there. The lavender hasn't been pulled." That same night, a group of graphic design students created a poster featuring a tilted lavender bloom in the background, and at the center, the image of the silver bracelet near the blood. At the bottom was one line, "Not because of who she was, but because no one should die like that." The poster spread quickly through university message boards. At 3 major campuses, students posted it on the main bulletin boards. No one was called to the streets. Yet, by morning, as service vehicles passed through Laverne, they began to see windows cracked open. Each window held a single sprig of purple. Some were real lavender, some paper, but all were placed neatly in mugs or recycled glass jars. The authorities had not responded. The police department still held the original report. But within local media circles, a veteran editor submitted the news brief to Content Review with a note, "Can't be ignored anymore. This won't stay buried." At the same time, former Laverne residents began to speak out. A middle-aged black woman, who had moved away after her son was stopped and questioned by police in their yard for suspicious movement, wrote on her page, "I know that yard. I used to sit on that fence with my son. I knew that woman. We used to hand each other brooms to sweep leaves together. I didn't see the gun, but I know what silence looks like." Her post was shared nearly 30,000 times in less than a day. The hashtag Lavender Blood was no longer just a neighborhood label. It had become a symbol of a kind of death the system called a neighborhood-level incident, but the people now called by its real name, a crime without a camera, until the camera happened to see. In a city once used to nameless deaths, this time blood touched a purple flower, and people began to remember the event, not by evidence, but by image. No one stepped forward to lead, no organization claimed to have started it, but by the third night, lone wreaths began appearing next to streetlights across residential neighborhoods. No names were signed, but at the center of each wreath was a simple image of the silver bracelet. A small circular mark beside a red stain on tile. News spread quickly, but personal information spread faster. Among the tweets tagged with lavender blood, between photos of purple flowers and silver bands, one video clip resurfaced. Grainy, filmed from a distance, behind another fence. In it, a man wearing a gray coat stepped past a yellow barricade, into a scene no one else was allowed to approach. He wasn't in uniform. He didn't speak to the press, but when he knelt and placed his hand on a tile next to the woman's body, those watching realized that action did not belong to a bureaucrat. That back, the close-cropped hair, the posture sharp as a crease down a pressed shirt, it all pointed to a familiar image from national television, but one usually seen only during closed federal briefings or security hearings. A political science student pulled a frame from the clip and compared it with photographs from last year's Department of Defense summit. That face appeared in just 2 shots, standing among senior generals, not speaking, only watching the president with an expression like steel in the desert. The student posted the side-by-side image with the caption, "We found Gloria Carter's son." And none of us were ready for this. His name first appeared in a tweet at 8:19 p.m. Eastern, Marshall D. Carter, commander of the United States Strategic Command. Social media froze. The original post was viewed more than 1 million times in under 2 hours. The surge in traffic overwhelmed the platform. Independent news outlets scrambled to cross-check. A veteran military correspondent confirmed through 3 sources: photo ID, appearance on the National Security Council roster, and Department of Defense personnel files. All matched. Soon after, a local news anchor posted a single line, no image, no hashtag, just 6 words. Whose mother did they just kill? That sentence was shared tens of thousands of times, untouched. No edits, no summaries, just 6 words. Sharp as a blade, cold as metal, that stopped a nation. No one had asked the question that way before. Not who was the victim, not who was responsible, but a reversal. Whose mother was killed? The question didn't just pierce emotion. It reached the core of the system's fear. For the first time, the victim was no longer anonymous, no longer a data point, no longer a temporary line in a closed case file. This person had a son, and that son had the authority to mobilize the military. And so, the usual defenders of procedure fell silent, not because they suddenly felt wrong, but because they understood that defending it further might mean the system shielding them would no longer hold up under this fury. Within less than 6 hours after the identity was confirmed, right-wing groups began deleting posts. Conservative news channels stopped dismissing the emotional overreaction of minority communities. Commentators known for framing tragic law enforcement incidents vanished from broadcasts. No one dared frame a narrative to counter that name. Marshall D. Carter was not an activist, not a civil rights attorney, not a protester. He was the kind of person who, when he walked into a room, even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs sat straighter. And his mother had just been killed in her yard by 2 officers who thought she was just another old black woman without anyone to protect her. Is that? Now they knew. And the question was no longer in the hands of those who wrote the report. It lay in the hands of those now trembling as they reread the files they had once signed. The meeting was called on Friday morning, unscheduled, without a press advisory, with no media access permitted. The location was the 9th floor of a federal government building in the northeast sector, a floor normally reserved for national emergency hearings. There was no nameplate on the door, no one is waiting outside, but inside every seat was already arranged. 18 people were present. 3 from the Department of Justice, 5 from the Federal Council, and 9 representing the Department of Defense and strategic security agencies. And 1 person entered last, needing no introduction. Marshall Carter brought no aides, no folders. He wore the same suit from the quiet funeral 2 days prior. The white shirt had been replaced with black. His tie was so dark it nearly vanished into the jacket. His expression neither stiffened nor softened. It held the exact calm people recognized from red-sealed briefings, a stillness that felt cold. When he sat at the head of the table, no one spoke for the first 3 minutes. Everyone understood the protocol. The person who calls the meeting speaks first. And that person today was the son of the woman whose death had triggered the most intense public outrage in the last 10 years. Not because she died, but because she was killed in her yard. "Thank you for coming," Marshall began. "I called this meeting for one reason only. We no longer have time to process this at the district level." No one reacted. "I am not asking for action from you today. I am asking for acknowledgement." He paused deliberately, letting the words drop to the floor of the silence. Then he continued. "The video has been verified. The silver bracelet from the footage is in forensic custody. The blood matches. The gun was fired. The bullet was retrieved. The report was falsified. None of that is up for debate anymore." He looked toward the Justice Department. One of the 3 representatives shifted slightly but said nothing. "I do not need them to apologize to my mother." For the first time, Marshall's voice carried a subtle change in tone. "I need them to tell the truth before I authorize deployment." That final sentence was not raised, but its weight shifted the entire room. A federal council member tilted his head, set his pen down, and his hand froze in place, as if stillness were the only way to prevent further reaction. Marshall offered no further explanation. In any other meeting, that sentence might have been called a threat, but here it was a legal warning, because none of the 18 present had forgotten that Marshall D. Carter held full operational authority over Strategic Command, the division capable of locking down local bases, taking control of emergency networks, and if necessary launching cross-jurisdictional investigations beyond state reach. No governor could block it. No police department could refuse. "Social media has moved 3 days ahead of you," he continued. "The public is doing your job, documenting the facts, distributing the evidence, demanding transparency. If we fall behind one more step, what has rotted will no longer be corrected. It will be removed." A national security official took a deep breath, asking softly, "Are you planning a full internal investigation of the state's law enforcement system?" Marshall shook his head. "I'm not planning. I'm proceeding." No one responded. Only eyes moved, from one face to another, then back to him, the man who had just declared a purge without protest, without slogans. A structural reckoning launched not from a courtroom, but from a silent table, where a son did not come to beg for justice, but to make sure the truth would never again be rewritten to fit institutional convenience. 17 hours after the meeting on the 9th floor, Dean Mathers was arrested at his home. No summons, no advance notice, no local officers involved. The Strategic Command Emergency Response Unit conducted the operation. 4 agents in plain clothes, no visible insignia. They arrived in an unmarked vehicle and entered the suburban house while Dean was watching the evening news, remote still in hand. He didn't resist. From the moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, it seemed he understood. This time was not like before, not because the woman had died, but because her son did not stand outside the system. He stood above it. They took Dean out the back. No neighbors saw. No press was present. Local law enforcement wasn't informed. When the car turned onto the highway, Dean vanished from the map of civilian justice. Holt was no longer home. He disappeared from the precinct the moment the leaked video was confirmed authentic. Security cameras showed him leaving the parking lot with 3 duffel bags. No weapon, no badge, no farewell note. A young officer later reported seeing him withdraw cash from an ATM near his old barracks before heading toward the state border. An arrest warrant was issued 2 hours after Dean's capture, but Holt didn't get far. 5 hours later, at a federal checkpoint near the Virginia-Maryland line, Holt's vehicle was stopped. The officers didn't ask why he was leaving the state. They confirmed his name, then asked him to step out. He didn't resist. As they cuffed him, his lips moved slightly, as if he had rehearsed a justification, but gave up. The 2 men were taken back to Washington in separate convoys, 4 hours apart. Their transport schedules were not released. Their names didn't appear in any press bulletin. They disappeared from public record, but not because the system shielded them, because the system had been stripped of its ability to shield. Inside a secured Defense Department facility, allocated for high-level internal inquiry, Dean sat in a white room, 3 concrete walls, and 1 two-way mirror. No one has questioned him yet. No one asked his name. He sat in silence under a camera that recorded every breath, every prolonged second of stillness. There was nothing to say, and he knew, this time, silence was no longer a sanctuary. In another room, Holt was kept separately. When a watch officer handed him a cup of water, he asked only one question: "Can I write my statement?" The officer didn't reply, but left the paper. 3 hours later, Holt finished 3 pages. No header, no I am, just a sequence of what had happened, unedited, unclaimed. At the bottom of page 3, instead of signing his name, he wrote 4 words: "I should have," then left it blank. No one knew what he had meant to write next, but now both men were in the same place. A place neither had imagined they would ever face from this side of the table. Holt was brought into the interrogation room on the morning of the 3rd day since his arrest. A white room, a metal chair, a flat steel table, and a thick case file placed in the center. The investigator wore plain clothes, gave no name. He didn't carry a notepad, didn't turn on a recorder. He simply placed his hand on the folder, then slid it gently toward Holt. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready." Holt looked down at the file. The spine was worn. The first page was stained with an old coffee mark. There was no title, but on page 2 was a photo of Dean Mathers, taken over 10 years ago, standing in front of a patrol car with a smile that could be pride or disdain. "I saw him beat people," Holt said, voice hoarse, nearly cracked from lack of sleep. 3 times in the last 2 years. The investigator didn't react. He opened a notebook, pulled out a blank sheet, and lowered his pen. "Start from the beginning, chronologically, detail by detail. I don't need emotion. I need every sentence." Holt began. The first case was in the parking lot behind the old shopping center. A young black man was detained for suspected vandalism. Dean didn't read him his rights, didn't ask his name. He just said, "Stay still," then kicked the man down when he stepped back out of fear. The second case was an elderly woman, drunk, who wandered into a park after curfew. Dean shoved her into the patrol car, struck her in the back of the head when she screamed. Holt was in the front seat. He heard it. He didn't turn around. The third case was a boy, 16 years old, held for suspected shoplifting. Dean grabbed his collar, slammed his head against the wall of the store's security office. Holt saw it through the one-way mirror. He didn't intervene. Later, he wrote the report himself, stating the suspect hit the wall while resisting. 3 files. 3 witnesses, all of them Dean. Every case was closed with the same familiar line: insufficient evidence, did not meet criteria for excessive force. Holt read that sentence again as the investigator slid the printed copies across the table. "Your words," the man said. "Would you like to revise any of them?" Holt didn't respond, but this time he signed every page, marked the time, and on the last one, instead of leaving the line blank like before, he added a single sentence at the bottom. "I used to believe it wasn't my place. Now I know silence is an act." The statement file was delivered directly to the Special Coordination Office at the Department of Defense. Marshal Carter received the report at midnight and read it for 40 minutes without standing. He didn't take out his phone. He didn't call the press. He pressed only one button in the internal command system: request a full audit of all records involving Officer Dean Mathers, past 15 years. All states, all jurisdictions, remove internal review tags, reclassify closed status, treat all files as active investigations. State-level approval not required. The command was encrypted under a separate authority reserved only for the commander of Strategic Command. 8 minutes later, more than 39 case files in the federal security system were unsealed and marked as under verification. A new file was created: pattern of law enforcement conduct showing signs of systemic violation, possible internal shielding, priority subject, Mathers, Dean, witness, Holt, Caleb. This was no longer a personal case. It was the dismantling of a mechanism built on procedure and sealed by collective silence. Among dozens of reopened reports from the emergency sweep, there was a thin file buried between vague incident logs with no clear title, no red priority stamp. The data technician nearly skipped over it, failing to find a victim's name. The case was labeled with a short description: unidentified minor shot while moving outside restricted hours. Time, 5:08 a.m., November 12th, 7 years prior. Location, a small corner in Westfield, a neighborhood largely white, with a few black families who had moved in after a zoning expansion. Only 3 pages made up the file. The first was a hastily written incident report, incomplete, signed by Dean Mathers at the bottom. The second was a medical examiner's summary. Male, approximately 14 to 15 years old, 1 gunshot wound to the lower back, pronounced dead at the scene. The final page was a closure summary. Undetermined case, no next of kin, no identification. Body transferred to coroner's office and buried per unknown subject protocol. No one asked why the boy was there before dawn, carrying a newspaper bag, wearing the uniform of a local print shop, and because no one asked, the incident sank into the thousands of unspoken deaths, stored in the system like a smudge scrubbed from the inside. But this time, the system could no longer stay silent. A member of the Special Investigations Committee, an entity temporarily established under the direct authority of the Federal Department of Justice, placed the file in the center of a hearing room, among nearly 50 others. He tapped his finger on the cover, then looked directly into the live streaming camera, broadcasting the first public hearing in the Gloria Carter case. "This boy didn't lack a name," he said. "We just never asked." Within 2 hours of the file's release, a woman called the hotline. She recognized the blurred uniform shirt shown on screen. It was her son. His name was Devin H., 15 years old, delivering papers for a friend who had the flu. She had called the police 36 times in the 2 months after he went missing. No one responded. A missing persons report was never filed because no criminal activity was confirmed. The hearing stalled for several minutes after the announcement. Not one official, military or civilian, could turn away from what the system had once chosen not to see. At the next press briefing, for the first time in the history of federal investigation panels, an internal report was broadcast live on national television. It was not a criminal indictment. It was an admission. White zones, residential areas with near no enforcement prosecutions, were real. They had existed in classified reports for years, hidden behind language like crime reduction priority areas. The system had labeled them civically stable, low enforcement risk. But when the data was released, the truth became undeniable. Those shot, arrested, or beaten mostly came from opposite neighborhoods, and their presence in white zones was often treated as a disruption. A senior committee member said bluntly on air, "We used to call that stability because no one reacted, but really, it was our inaction that allowed wrong to thrive." More than 30 administrative maps were reclassified. Nearly 800 cases were converted from closed to active investigations, and for the first time, the system could no longer justify ignoring victims simply because they hadn't been able to speak. From New York to Oakland, from small neighborhoods in Nebraska to the central square of Chicago, people began to take to the streets. No one gave the order. No official group claimed to have started it, but thousands, then hundreds of thousands, stepped out of their homes, carrying purple wreaths, printed images of a silver bracelet, and handwritten signs. At first, the slogans were familiar: "Justice for Gloria" and "Stop the cover-ups." No one should die for their skin color. But within 36 hours of the confirmation about the paperboy Devin, the slogans shifted. The new phrase appeared first on a plain piece of cardboard, held by a young white woman at a park in Minneapolis. She didn't chant. She just held it up. A photographer captured the moment and posted it on Twitter. Within 10 minutes, the image spread, printed on banners in Boston, projected on LED screens in Seattle, spoken aloud in a speech at UCLA. The message didn't demand revolution. It posed a simple truth. How many people had fallen without time to alert their loved ones, and how many families had waited years to hear even one word of justice call their name. At the same time, universities announced a series of public forums. Public schools used civics classes to discuss white zones. On nightly news broadcasts, commentators no longer asked, "Is this an isolated incident?" They now asked, "How long have we stayed silent?" On the 10th evening after the Gloria Carter case, the Federal Press Office officially confirmed Marshall Carter would appear publicly. No spokesperson, no traditional press briefing, no speechwriters. The broadcast took place in Lafayette Square, directly in front of the White House's north facade. The stage was simple, just a podium, no backdrop, no lighting effects. Security was present but visibly unarmed. People called it the first non-ceremonial appearance of a sitting general officer in United States history. Marshall stepped up to the podium at exactly 7 p.m. White shirt, gray trousers, jacket unbuttoned. He walked slowly. No one guided him, no teleprompter. Once in place, he looked forward, toward thousands who stood in silence, not chanting, only watching. A light wind stirred, lifting the edge of his shirt. He didn't adjust the mic. He simply rested his hands on the podium, took a breath, and began, "I'm not here to represent the military, and I'm not here to represent my family." His voice wasn't loud, but each word struck like taps on glass. Not shattering, but enough to quiet all other sounds. "I'm here because this system has operated for too long on a premise we never dared to admit, that when the victim has no name, we feel permitted to rewrite their story into something more acceptable." A woman in the front row bowed her head, clutching a small board with a boy's photo. Around 13 years old, his face faded with time, eyes still wide as if waiting for someone to say his name. Some died while on the job, some were beaten before they could explain, some were arrested because their skin color made them not look like they belonged here. But what pains me most isn't the deaths. He paused, eyes turning to the far right corner, where a group of students held paper lavender flowers. What pains me most is how we've come to accept letting those deaths pass, as if they don't deserve to be remembered. The wind eased, but the air in the square grew heavier. No one moved, no one left, though nearly an hour had passed since the speech began. No flashing screens, no music to fill the silence. Only one man standing there, white shirt soaked with sweat down his back, hands still on the podium, eyes unmoving. "I'm not here to hunt the men who killed my mother." The words weren't loud, but thousands below felt as if something sharp had been pulled from their chest, fast, cold, and deep. "I know who they are," Marshall continued. "I know their names. I know what they did, second by second. I have the power to bring them before any court within a day." He paused again. Not to emphasize, but to keep his voice from breaking. "But if I stopped there, I'd be no different from the system that killed my mother." His eyes swept across the front row, where people once silenced had sent letters, made calls, and been ignored. "I'm not chasing the man who killed my mother. I'm dismantling a habit." No one asked what the habit was, but everyone understood. It was the habit of looking away when a colleague was wrong, the habit of closing a file instead of reopening it, the habit of writing no witnesses instead of finding one, the habit of believing that if the dead person wasn't famous, the truth didn't need to be complete. That habit wasn't written in law. It lived in the indifference of a report's tone, in rehearsed excuses. How a system lulled itself to sleep with numbers that said, "Just another isolated case." "We were taught that some places are stable because no one gets arrested," Marshall continued. "But what kind of stability requires the disappearance of evidence, of names, of memory?" He lifted his hands from the podium and stepped forward. There was no space between him and the crowd anymore, just a man standing inside a community saying something anyone else could have said long ago. This is not a battle between black people and police, not between victims and perpetrators. It's between the habit of turning away and the choice to stay. At that moment, a soft sound rose from the crowd. Someone had touched a silver bracelet around their neck. The leather brushed against metal. "And if someone chooses to stay," Marshall said, "then the system can no longer stay the same." He stepped back to the podium but said nothing more. He simply looked into the lens of the live broadcast camera, and then the system began to crack. Something it had long dismissed, consent, now returned. Not to agree silently, but to collectively refuse to look away. Across police departments in multiple states, young officers began submitting resignation letters citing personal ethical conflict. Instructors at law enforcement academies called for revised curricula. Veteran officers, once praised for maintaining order, saw their records re-examined for years no one had questioned. And in civics classrooms across the country, students no longer asked how to manage a situation. They started asking, "The person who died that day, did they ever sit next to me in school?" No one needed to tear down the system. It cracked on its own, from the inside, by the very thing it once believed was its weakest link, the truth. Washington, D.C., a closed-door meeting at the Federal Justice Office took place on Monday morning, 3 days after Marshall Carter's public appearance. Inside a rectangular room deep within the West Executive Avenue headquarters, typically used for reviewing federal constitutional violations, a report was placed on a long wooden table covered in gray cloth. The chief legal advisor, a Puerto Rican woman who had once served as national coordinator for criminal justice reform, stood and delivered a concise summary. "We have re-examined more than 40,000 use of force enforcement records over the past 10 years. The preliminary result: at least 60 cases closely mirrored the circumstances of Gloria Carter's death, all marked as closed for internal reasons and never escalated to the federal level." No one in the room was surprised, but no one remained still. Those present, including representatives from the FBI, the Attorney General's office, and 2 federal judges, understood perfectly. The phrase "internal reasons" was never a reason. It was the system's way of naming collective silence. During that same session, a young FBI analyst specializing in reprocessing legacy data was asked to present. Her name was Mia Aldridge, only 30 years old, less than 6 years in the Bureau, previously dismissed for suggesting a review of cases with duplicate reports and no indictment. This time, she stepped forward, placed a hard drive into the reader, and opened a series of decrypted documents. On screen appeared a case file labeled Dean Mathers, with an identification code linked to the Westfield State Police Department, North Carolina. The timestamp showed the last access date, June 4th, 4 years prior. But the notable detail wasn't in the file's content. It was in what happened afterward. Mia clicked into the secure access log. A list appeared. Among them, one urgent request stood out: request for permanent deletion, record no longer prosecutable, submitted by command level. The requester was an officer named Raymond Voss, then the state's chief commander, now retired. The file held no specific reason, no verification, and no system response. Yet following the request, all related data on 2 civilian assault complaints against Dean were flagged pending deletion within 7 days. Critically, that date coincided exactly with the period Dean was reassigned to the Laverne district, where Gloria Carter's death would occur 4 years later. The room fell silent as the playback ended. Mia stepped down without comment. She left only one sentence in her handwritten report submitted to the committee: "If the system did not forget, then those who thought they escaped have nowhere left to hide." That same afternoon, a special summons was issued to former state-level commanders, demanding full disclosure of all deletion protocols from 2010 to 2022. By 7 p.m., the Office of the Inspector General for Public Safety issued an emergency provision: suspend all state-level access to archived enforcement records to facilitate interagency investigation. And by morning, 42 files previously removed from the system due to insufficient violation criteria were fully restored across the federal oversight network. By now, what began as an isolated death had unfolded into something deeper, a level where names once buried in files or deliberately erased from history were surfacing not because someone screamed, but because the very people the system once protected were now too powerless to deny it. That evening, as the restored files were being re-encrypted for secure transfer, Marshal Carter returned to his command office in Virginia without Justice Department clearance, without a press briefing, without internal memos. On the 12th floor coordination room, he sat alone for over an hour with only a whiteboard and 3 old case folders. The board displayed no flowcharts, no agency hierarchy, only 2 lines in thick black marker. Why didn't we know? Or did we know and choose not to look? Soon after, he convened a private meeting with just 3 people: a data forensics expert who once led global anti-money laundering systems, a former military inspector who had resigned over a cover-up scandal, and a civilian intelligence officer whose name had never appeared in any public report. There were no written appointments, no formal authorities. But the moment they entered the room, all 3 understood they were not about to conduct an investigation. They were about to reverse engineer an entire memory system buried under the phrase, "closed for internal factors." Marshall ordered the reconstruction of a special trace system, a parallel record analysis network, outside Justice Department authority, not stored on government servers, reporting only to him. Each piece of data would be triple encrypted, verified through mirrored protocols, and could not be accessed or altered by any state or municipal agency. There would be no 4th-level access, no external overrides. None of the 3 operatives would see the entire map. Each held only a segment, and they would only reconvene when the strands needed stitching. The project's internal designation was M05, short for May 05 Retrace Protocol. But within the team, it had another name, a name that wasn't technical and didn't pretend to be neutral. The May that was dimmed. It was a reminder of springs rewritten in administrative memos, as if quiet meant progress, as if silence was a sign of peace, as if unprotested deaths meant they had been properly handled. It was the name they gave to records folded shut in the most beautiful month of the year, then stamped, unlikely to recur even when the bloodstains remained, and the ones lost never return. That name appeared on every internal document, not to evoke sympathy, but so that every line of data reopened had to pass through one unspoken question. Was that another May we chose not to see? From the day the project launched, high-level commanders began receiving internal notices. All records previously requested for deletion or marked insufficient evidence will be reviewed, starting from low-level access logs, including handwritten notes and informal witness statements. No one dared say they disagreed, because everyone knew when a system once used its power to pretend it didn't know, the only way to rebuild it was to place that power into the hands of those who could no longer pretend. The hearing took place Monday at 8:15 inside a soundproof room at the Federal Coordination Office in Northern Virginia. No press, no public, just 8 people at a long table. 3 ethics investigators, 2 legal reps, 1 psychologist, and 2 members of the May That Was Dimmed task force. Holt entered through a side door, uncuffed. White shirt, all buttons fastened, no tie, hair shorter than the last time his name was in the news. He didn't sit right away. He looked at each person in the room as if confirming something silent. When offered a seat, he pulled the chair back, sat upright, hands flat on the table. "I didn't come here to ask for leniency," he said. The room, already quiet, grew heavier. An investigator slid forward a file labeled Dean Mather's Eternal Conduct. "You signed all of these. We need to know what you remember." Holt didn't touch the file. He breathed in and began, voice calm, unwavering, more guilt than memory. The first was the boy in the parking lot. Dean hit him. I wrote fell while fleeing. He made me rewrite it twice. The second, the elderly woman in the park. She cried. I wrote she slipped and added, officer responded appropriately to perceived threat. The third, the kid in the mall. Dean slammed his head into the wall. I heard it. I did nothing. Wrote, lost balance during struggle. I knew the camera was out. That's why Dean chose that room. No one spoke. Holt continued. I once told someone Dean shouldn't still be on duty. Whispered it. Never filed it. When they got reassigned, I said nothing. Pause. Someone asked, did Dean coerce you? Holt shook his head. No, I just didn't dare go against him. The words hit with quiet weight. Holt pulled a paper from his pocket. I rewrote every report I ever edited. Every word, every tone. Every line I deleted because I thought it sounded too dramatic. An investigator took the sheet, handwritten, raw. One line stood out. Every word I ever changed was a piece of truth I erased from this world. Holt looked directly across the table. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just to speak the truth while someone still listens. He nodded, not to conclude, but to accept the truth's weight. The hearing ended before noon. Holt left in silence. No one touched his shoulder. No one spoke. The room didn't move. Eyes stayed on the paper he left behind. A lawyer at the end of the table leaned toward a colleague. He spoke softly, not for the record, not expecting it to be heard beyond the room. We don't need more good people. We need fewer people who choose silence. The colleague nodded. A third person heard it. Then a fourth. The sentence didn't appear in the transcript, but that afternoon it was pinned to the internal bulletin board at the National Investigation Office. 2 days later, at the opening of a federal session, attendees passed under a white banner. No seal, no slogan. Just one line, unpunctuated. We don't need more good people, we need fewer people who choose silence. It didn't demand heroism, it didn't preach ideals, it simply named what the system had allowed. Goodness measured by silence, not integrity. That silence had once killed, erased, and let Dean stay untouched for 15 years. The line spread not as a slogan but a watermark, printed on the footer of new case files, taped behind staff ID cards, handwritten in interns' notebooks. By month's end, the Inspector General ordered it posted in every internal audit meeting room, not for show, but as a reminder. No one stays clean just because they stay quiet. That morning, the Capitol building was brighter than on any typical hearing day. Additional lighting had been installed at the special request of the Commission on Human Rights and Law Enforcement hearings, not for media purposes but to ensure that every angle of the session was captured clearly, leaving no moment darkened by camera position or technical error. This was the first public hearing in federal history opened for a case not classified as a criminal offense. There were no charges, no defendants, no defense counsel, but nearly 300 officials, experts, advocates, and community representatives were present, many of whom had lost loved ones without ever stepping into a space that resembled justice. Marshal Carter sat in the center row, not at the presiding table. He wore no uniform. Just a white shirt, a light gray suit, no badge, no legal advisors. He did not attend as a commander. He came at the direct invitation of Congress, and because the truth needed someone who could restate it not with arguments, but with a presence no one could look away from. When his turn came, he stepped forward without any documents. He held only a wooden picture frame, the glass slightly scratched, containing a black and white photo. Old but clear. No one needed an introduction. No caption was required. He placed the frame on the table before him, facing the entire hall, then looked up at the commission. He did not begin with thanks, nor with a request to speak. He began with a question. How many people here have seen this child before? It was the boy who had once delivered newspapers, 15 years old. The only surviving photo had been printed from the office printer where he used to work. In the picture, he smiled softly, his head tilted slightly, wearing a faded white t-shirt with a logo, standing beside a stack of unbound papers. There was nothing extraordinary about that pose, and that, precisely, was why it had been forgotten so quickly. His name was Devin H. No one asked questions when he fell. No one knocked on his door to verify, and when his mother searched for him, they refused to open a case. They told her to wait a few more days. Marshall's voice didn't shift, no added emotion, but his gaze held everyone in the room firmly inside the story. The death of my mother was a strike across the face of the system, but this boy's death was the quiet cut that let the entire system rot from the inside. He did not mention Dean grabbing Gloria's wrist. He did not reference helicopters, files, investigations, or anything bearing his name. Today's hearing is not meant to prosecute anyone. It is meant for us to revisit how we once chose not to look. And if this is the first time Congress has allowed a case that was never criminally prosecuted to become the subject of a public hearing, I hope it won't be the last. Marshall stepped away from the podium, leaving the framed photograph behind. The image remained on the table, the glass catching the ceiling lights, reflecting the shadows of those who had passed by, a death remembered by nothing more than a case number. After the hearing, a senior member of the House made a closing statement. "We just witnessed a testimony without words, and sometimes it is precisely those silent images that compel the law to begin rewriting itself." The hearing room, following Marshall's final words, fell into a silence so heavy that not a single chair creaked. Not a pen tapped. The boy's photo remained there, quiet in the very way he had been forgotten for so many years. One investigator standing in the corner stepped forward, gently drawing the corner to dim the light reflecting off the photo's glass. But that small motion revealed more clearly the worn sneakers, the faded jeans Devin had worn the day the picture was taken. Marshall turned back to the podium. Without reaching for the microphone, he simply stood there, his eyes scanning the middle rows, where members of Congress sat upright, as if realizing they had just been yanked out of their safety zone. He did not raise his voice, but said a single sentence, meant not to close the hearing, but to open the most difficult part it had to confront. "If you still remember his name, then we still have a chance." No applause followed. No one spoke, but the clerk recording the transcript wrote the sentence down word for word, then underlined it 3 times, not out of regulation, but from personal urgency, to preserve something the law had never defined as important. A long pause followed that line. Then the Congresswoman from Ohio, once a vocal critic of expanding federal investigation, once a skeptic of racial bias allegations she called selective prejudice, requested to speak. A white woman with deep brown hair streaked with gray, small in frame, known for her sharp and stoic TV appearances, she walked to the podium with her hand trembling slightly. She brought no papers, did not glance at her colleagues. She looked only at Devin's photograph placed on the center table. "I used to think today's hearing was about a single incident," she said, her voice hoarse and slow, "that it was just a reactive moment, an unfortunate byproduct of an overloaded system." She paused, placed one hand over her chest, raised her chin, and inhaled audibly before continuing. What she said next did not exist in any prepared transcript. "I am sorry, not because America is wrong, but because I once believed I had nothing to do with it." Some people bowed their heads, a few blinked quickly, but it was the silence from the seats, usually filled with noise, that made her words sink deeper. She turned to Marshall. "You don't need me to apologize on behalf of the system. You need me to take responsibility for not speaking up when I had the chance." She stepped down, not waiting for applause, not needing comfort, but her image, with tears unwiped, was replayed on national television for more than 12 hours, not to inspire, but because someone had finally admitted, in the old system, silence was never neutral. Less than 3 weeks after the historic hearing in Congress, a special directive was issued from the Office of Federal Public Security Coordination to all police academies across the United States. The title stated clearly, "Mandatory Training Revision Directive Addition of Implicit Bias Recognition Module." For the first time in over 40 years, a subject unrelated to tactics, command skills, or use of force was being required as part of the core curriculum for the entire profession. Not every academy welcomed it. Some academy directors argued that bias was a psychological issue, not something that could be trained like a skill. But only 4 days later, public reaction, especially from families whose loved ones had been victims of wrongful force, pushed back all soft resistance. The course content was not simply about spotting signs of discrimination. It began with a lecture titled "When Power Becomes Habit and People Become Circumstances." The instructors were sociologists, legal historians, and at times, the very individuals who had once been wrongly arrested, beaten, or ignored, during years when their entire case file read one line, "No elements of violation found." But the most transformative shift came from a specific requirement. Starting in their second semester, each trainee was required to choose a closed enforcement case from the past 10 years, especially one with no prosecution, and rewrite the entire incident not from the police report, but in the voice of the person who suffered it. No one was allowed to choose a case from their own state. No one could use administrative language. No one could cite the report. They had to reimagine it, not through assumptions, but by placing themselves in the exact day, exact setting, exact blow or scream, using actual recorded data. A cadet in the Missouri State Academy broke down in class while reading the ending of their teammates' rewritten account. "My name is Malik. I am 16 years old. I said I didn't do anything, but they said my tone was uncooperative. I was hit in the stomach, in the head, and in my belief, and in the report I had no name." That essay was later cited in an internal report to the Federal Department of Homeland Security as an example of the effectiveness of role-based cognitive transformation in law enforcement training. At the Northern California National Academy, the program director added another step. After completing the first-person rewrite, trainees had to read it aloud in front of the class. No ghostwriting, no stand-ins. The writer had to voice the truth they had once viewed as technical data. At first, many trainees resisted. Some said they didn't join the force to perform moral theater, but eventually it was those who protested the loudest who stayed the quietest after reading their closing lines. One trainee in Texas wrote in their internal journal, "I never thought I'd have to say, I was just getting water for my mom, but they called me a threat. My voice when I read it was completely different from my voice when I wrote a patrol report, and I think that was the first time I ever heard how numb." That spring, the Illinois State Police Academy launched its first implicit bias recognition class, with nearly 80 second-year trainees. The class was held in an old auditorium, once used to simulate riot scenarios. Now, the rubber weapons had been removed, replaced with long tables, chairs arranged in a semicircle, and a large projector screen mounted on a bare white wall without slogans. Midway through the semester, instructors assigned the usual prompt: choose a closed use of force case with no prosecution to rewrite it from the voice of the person who was mistreated. Most cadets selected well-documented incidents, many reconstructing the victim's experience with near-clinical precision, from the exact date and time to the tone of voice. But one submission made both the instructors and the Academy Board pause longer than usual. It wasn't long. It didn't use many details, but the opening line made people sit up and read on. "I'm not black, but I know what it feels like to be seen as extra." The cadet who wrote it was Ryan Hale, 21 years old, white, raised in a trailer park in southern Iowa. His father died in a construction accident. His mother worked night shifts as a waitress. Ryan dropped out of high school because he couldn't afford the fee to retake a failed social studies exam. He was admitted to the academy under a special program for youth from low-income areas. In his essay, Ryan didn't retell a use of force case from the perspective of a black victim. He chose a 12-year-old Latino boy, not beaten, not arrested, just searched outside his school gate while waiting for his mother to bring his jacket. The boy didn't cry, but his hands trembled from shame. Ryan wrote no one called him by name, they only asked, "What do you have in your pocket?" He wasn't carrying a knife, but from the tone they used, he knew he was guilty before he opened his mouth. The essay ended with a single, unadorned line: "I was kicked out of a mall once while waiting for my mom to finish her shift. They didn't say anything rude, but their eyes said, 'This place isn't for you.'" The Academy's review board fell silent after reading it. A veteran instructor waved a ho-hum, at once opposed the course as too impractical, requested to step down from teaching, saying he no longer felt qualified to analyze emotions I once dismissed as weakness. In his resignation report, he wrote, "I taught defensive behavior, but I never taught cadets how to recognize the kind of silence that strips others of the right to be heard." A week later, Ryan's essay was printed in the internal curriculum under the title, the invisible stain. It wasn't analyzed as a reaction technique. It wasn't turned into a lesson on soft handling. It was used as a warm-up reading for all opening sessions. Each cadet was asked to read a passage aloud, then write a short response to the question, "Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong somewhere?" Not everyone could write something. Not everyone could say it out loud, but one thing became clear. The lesson was no longer about someone else's mistakes. It was about admitting the times we stayed silent, even just to keep the peace. On the morning of June 15th, in Hearing Room 5 of the Capitol building, a solemn message was printed on the notice board. Emergency hearing on the Reasonable Suspicion Act. Petition for review after 56 years. This marked the first time since 1967 that the foundational law governing the right of police to suspect and act in the field was brought back to the federal discussion table, not because of a lawsuit, nor due to a social movement, but because the data disclosed by the Special Investigations System revealed that reasonable suspicion had become one of the most easily distorted tools, lacking any specific verification standards beyond the personal intuition of the enforcing officer. The bill was not proposed to eliminate the concept of reasonable suspicion, but to redefine it. Its title, the Substantiated Risk Clarification Act. Justice Beyond Gut Feeling. The bill's lead sponsor was Senator Amy Caldwell, a moderate Republican from Michigan, co-authored by Representative Jamal Rivers, a black criminal attorney and former federal prosecutor from New Jersey. In her opening statement, Caldwell was direct. "I do not oppose police having the right to act quickly in emergencies, but I do oppose our willingness to treat a sense of danger as evidence, especially when that feeling is never verified and often only arises when certain skin colors are involved." The new bill mandates that any official report based on perceived threat must answer two explicit questions: who specifically was at risk in this situation, and what evidence, apart from behavior and skin color, made the officer feel threatened. If these questions go unanswered, the report will be reclassified as lacking substantiated grounds for reasonable suspicion, and any subsequent action may be considered excessive force. More critically, the bill states that a sense of danger is no longer a valid justification unless accompanied by at least one objective factor, such as clear behavior, a verifiable emergency, or an independent witness statement. When asked about the bill's practical feasibility, Representative Rivers responded succinctly, "If we trust officers to handle firearms, we should also trust that they're capable of recognizing a real threat, not just a selective instinct." The hearing lasted more than 7 hours. Many contrasting views emerged. Some representatives from police associations argued that the bill could cause hesitation in fast-moving scenarios, but opponents emphasized that it was precisely the vagueness of the old definition that allowed deaths like Devon H's and Gloria Carter's to be dismissed without ever asking the right question: a threat to whom, and what was the proof? That same day, 47 police academies nationwide registered to pilot the bill's proposed procedures for practical evaluation. Within just 10 days, 6 police departments from states with the highest rates of enforcement violence also volunteered to participate, without waiting for the law to pass. A bill aimed at redefining the right to suspect was never meant to close a chapter of past mistakes. It was the opening signal that the system must now justify itself, not with protocol, but with a question it had never dared to ask. If fear alone is enough to justify pulling the trigger, then who protects those always seen through the lens of fear? The hearing entered its 3rd day, and political pressure was visibly mounting. On conservative media outlets, questions kept surfacing: redefining reasonable suspicion, or restructuring the entire law enforcement system. Some commentators went further, accusing Marshall Carter, the man behind many recent investigative and reform initiatives, of using the name of justice to expand military influence into civilian domains. At an extended legislative session hosted by the Committee on Legal Reassessment, where Marshall was invited to provide advisory input on the applicability of the Entity Risk Clarification Act, a conservative congressman from Arizona, formerly the chair of the Homeland Security Committee, stood up and posed a question in a tone bordering on confrontation. "Mr. Carter, with all due respect, you're a military officer. Your place is in the Pentagon, not the halls of Congress. Are you suggesting that the military should rewrite police law?" The room fell into a hush. Some people exchanged glances. Others prepared to take notes. It was the first time since Marshall had entered these hearings that someone openly questioned his role and boundaries, without metaphor, without diplomatic phrasing. Marshall didn't respond immediately. He stood up slowly, didn't reach for notes, and didn't look toward the chair. He simply turned and faced the man who had asked the question. "Congressman," he said, his voice low but cutting through the room, "I don't want the military to rewrite police law." Pause. Just long enough for the tension to hold, just long enough for the audience to think he had finished. Then he continued, his voice clearer. "I want citizens to rewrite how they want to live." No one could sit upright fast enough, because that response didn't target the individual. It didn't detour into technicalities. It brought the debate's entire weight back to where it belonged. The human right to self-determination in a society meant to serve them, not to preserve the machinery that had long ceased to ask what they needed. Marshall didn't emphasize the word citizens, but the way he used it, not as an abstraction, but as something plain and rightful, forced everyone who had ever sat in a national security meeting to take a step back in their reasoning. His speech wasn't long, he didn't elaborate, but that one answer spread far beyond the chamber, aired live on national television, quoted across social media platforms, and became the day's most widely shared headline. "I don't want the military to rewrite police law. I want citizens to rewrite how they want to live." It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a quiet warning that couldn't be ignored. If the people most affected no longer believe the law was made to protect them, then there is no reason to preserve a system designed to run over them without ever asking what they needed. As hearings continued and the new bill approached a full vote, a quiet notice appeared on the internal bulletin of the Eastern States Department of Justice. Commander Raymond Voss has officially retired, effective midnight on the 21st. No press release, no ceremony, but everyone who had followed the Dean Mathers investigation knew what it meant. Voss was the official who closed Dean's misconduct cases 5 years ago, writing "no exceptional circumstances" on internal memos. That decision kept 2 assault reports from being reopened and allowed Dean to transfer posts with a clean record. Now, with those records coming back into view, Voss left without a word, his silence speaking louder than denial. 2 days later, a new leak surfaced from Westmore County, California. A 2018 shooting, once listed as homicide, had quietly been reclassified as an accidental operational error. The victim, a 14-year-old boy, shot in his grandmother's yard during a mistaken raid. Footage later showed he was holding a water bottle, not resisting. The change came from the deputy DA at the time, now a professor. The leaked document was found not by a whistleblower or hacker, but by a junior legal staffer reviewing training files. She didn't go public. She sent it to an internal audit board. That alone triggered a broader review. Within days, over 30 cases were flagged for similar changes. The new question wasn't who pulled the trigger, but who softened the truth so it wouldn't look like a crime. On Monday, inboxes across federal and state offices received a single file, with no password, no encryption, titled simply, "List of those who thought no one would look." There were no instructions, no usage guidelines. But the moment the content was opened, everyone understood. This wasn't a report, not a petition, not an internal complaint. This was a memo, but not for the system. It was for the public. The list was over 500 names long. Every single one had been involved in redirecting, blurring, or halting investigations into cases with signs of civil rights violations, improper use of force, or fabricated incident reports. None of them were arrested. None received a subpoena, but every name was made public, along with their exact role, timing, and the specific action they took. Under each name there was no charge, just one line of description. Replace the phrase "shot" with "injured during altercation" in the June 2018 report, or declined to verify roadside camera footage due to device not meeting legal standards, or dismissed 4 witness statements as inconsistent with officer's account. The language used was not bitter, not insulting, but every word felt like a needle. It didn't stab, but it stung enough to leave a mark. No one was called a perpetrator, but no one could hide behind the vague concept of official in duty anymore. The document was posted in full on the official website of the Federal Independent Investigation Task Force at 9 o'clock in the morning. Within 2 hours, it had been reshared over 300,000 times. No one asked the public to do it. No one called for a reckoning. A new habit simply formed. People shared it with the caption, "I read the whole thing." No headline called it a blacklist. No newscast labeled it an indictment because the content didn't resemble any traditional expose. It wasn't meant to shame, it was simply light, placed precisely. And when the light was clear enough, people began to see themselves in the mirror. A police academy principal resigned. A former prosecutor withdrew from the Judicial Oversight Board. A forensics trainer declared, "I will not continue teaching in a system I helped break." They weren't forced, they weren't chased, but for the first time they knew silence now had an attached record. At a town hall in western West Virginia, a printed copy of the list was pinned to a public bulletin board. No one tore it down. No one spray-painted it. At the bottom of the page, someone had written with a marker, "We don't need them all arrested, but we need them all seen." From that moment on, a name was no longer just a name. It was the start of a collective memory, where no one would be allowed to dodge responsibility by saying, "I didn't know." On an October morning, at a private meeting on the 8th floor of the Democratic Party headquarters, 15 senior members unanimously agreed no one but Marshall Carter had the credibility, integrity, and public trust to represent the party in the next presidential election. Marshall led national trust polls not because of promises, but because he made people believe the justice system could admit its own wrongs. He didn't belong to any faction, never spoke from a script, but every time he appeared, whether at a hearing or a schoolyard, people listened, because his voice came from loss, not training. The nomination was prepared. A campaign video was ready, ending with the question, "If he doesn't step up, then who will?" That evening, party leaders brought him the documents, the seal, and a message. "You changed the country. Now it's time to lead it." Marshall didn't reject the offer immediately. He pulled out an old letter, placed it on the table, and said, "I didn't do this to become president. I did this to stay a son." Then he added, "Not just for my mother, but because I once believed studying hard would protect me from being stopped for my skin. I now know justice isn't power. It's refusing to let grief become ambition." He returned the folder, uncreased and unsigned. The next day, instead of a press event, a photo appeared. Marshall, standing by his mother's grave, placing the silver bracelet in the statue's hand. The caption read, "I don't need to hold power. I just need to preserve memory intact." The interview was set for Saturday morning, in a setting far simpler than the weight of its central figure. A small room inside the National Institute for Civil History, tucked in the southern outskirts of Washington, D.C., is usually reserved for researchers or senior law students. No professional cameras, no studio lighting, just a table recorder, 2 cups of cold tea, and a young reporter from PBS Public Radio, chosen not for fame, but because she had once rewritten Dean's first report from the victim's perspective for the implicit bias class. Marshall sat across from her, still in his usual unassuming style. Button-up shirt without a tie, sleeves rolled high, eyes not on a lens but on the person in front of him, as if the question only mattered if heard by the right person, not broadcast wide. The conversation lasted over 30 minutes, covering what had changed, what still resisted, and why he refused to run for office while the nation looked to him as one of the few symbols of hope unclouded by politics. He didn't hesitate to speak about his mother, he didn't dodge mentions of Gloria, and he didn't hide the exhaustion of being handed titles he had never claimed for himself. Toward the end, as the Q&A neared its close, the reporter paused longer than usual. She looked down at her notebook, then up again, for the first time departing from the prepared structure. Her voice softened, no longer shaped by broadcast tone. "So, if not president, if not honored, what do you want to be remembered for?" The question wasn't political. It wasn't part of the plan. It sounded like something people ask themselves late at night, only now spoken aloud, to the right person at the right time. Marshall didn't answer immediately. He glanced out the left window where a maple tree had just begun to turn. Outside, a few children rode by on bicycles, unaware that the room they passed held one of the faces considered irreplaceable in modern legal reform. Then he turned back, not smiling, just lowering his voice as if afraid the words would blur if spoken any louder. "I don't need to be remembered." The reporter furrowed her brow, pen hovering. He continued, "I just need the next generation not to learn how to defend themselves. For living right." The answer didn't bring tears, but it quieted the room so completely that even the soft clinking between two teacups became the background rhythm. He stood up afterward, thanked her with a nod. No signature, no quote left for television, but the reporter knew that sound clip would be the ending, not just for the broadcast, but maybe for a chapter of history America had walked through with too many explosions and far too few timely whispers. House number 94 sat quietly on a small street in the Laverne neighborhood, still wearing the same worn gray paint from 3 years ago, when Gloria Carter was shot just beside the gravel path. No one restored it. No memorial plaque was placed. No organization requested to convert it into a museum. Though locals had once proposed naming it a site of justice, the Carter family declined. They did not want the pain sealed behind glass. They did not want people to visit a case. They only wanted the place preserved, just as it was when everything happened. The iron gate remained half-painted, and the grass inside the yard grew nearly to knee height. The old wooden chair where Gloria used to sit in the sun leaned to one side, one leg nearly rotted through. On the fence at the front yard, faded chalk marks still showed a line someone had written after the last internal hearing. "Mama stood here, and no one stood with her." No one knew who wrote it, but no one erased it. Many rains had come. Some letters faded, a few nearly vanished. But people could still read it, with a slow gaze, with a heartbeat that needed no sound to follow. That morning, a boy of about 12 stood before the fence. He wore an old denim jacket, hands in his pockets, his curly hair catching the light, his face tilted toward the blurred writing. He didn't take a photo. He didn't make a call. He didn't ask if anyone was coming. He just stood there, eyes lifted, as if reading something not on the wood but behind it, inside a moment the world had once ignored. House number 94 still sat quietly in Laverne, its gray pane unchanged since the day Gloria Carter was shot near the gravel path. No memorial, no museum. The Carter family refused. They didn't want pain framed behind glass. They didn't want a crime scene turned attraction. They only wanted the place kept as it was. The iron gate was half-painted. Weeds reached knee height, and Gloria's sun chair leaned, rotting. On the fence, faint chalk still read, "Mama stood here." And no one stood with her. No one claimed it. No one erased it. Rain had faded it, but it remained legible. Not in sight, but in silence. That morning, a boy, maybe 12, stood before the fence. Denim jacket, hands in pockets, eyes on the chalk. He didn't take photos, didn't speak. He just looked, reading not the words, but the space behind them. A neighbor watched from her window, wanting to step out, but stayed still. Years ago, she had turned away from Gloria's screams. Today, she didn't. Before leaving, the boy picked up a small stone and placed it gently on the slate below the faded line, a quiet marker, not to decorate, but to hold the space. Later, the neighbor came out and added a second stone. She wiped the wood, not the words, only the dust. No statue was built that day, but the fence now had 2 stones, side by side. That afternoon, the sky grayed early. The sun couldn't dry the dirt path. The lavender scent lingered, faint and late. A woman and her son arrived. He was 8, quiet, holding her sleeve. When they reached the fence, he looked long, then asked, "Who stands there now?" She paused, then knelt and said, "Maybe anyone who doesn't turn away." He nodded. She handed him a piece of chalk. "Keep this. Write what you need. Don't wait." He pocketed it carefully. As they walked off, the street stayed quiet, but no longer empty. Deep in the preservation vault of the Federal Military Archives, among hundreds of metal boxes containing relics from soldiers across wars, sits a box smaller than most. No special number, no seal, no high clearance tag. On the lid, only a faded line in pencil. "Do not display. Keep for those who need a reason not to turn away." Inside is a silver badge, its edges worn, the back scratched. Not polished, not mounted, not framed in velvet, just wrapped in plain cloth, alongside a folded slip of paper with ink fading at the edges. No one reads that note without stopping, not because it's grand, but because its simplicity makes it impossible to skim past. I don't need to be remembered as right, only remembered as the one who didn't turn away. No name, no date, but anyone who lived through the time after Gloria Carter's death knows who once carried that badge. Marshall Carter declined every form of honor. He kept his name off reform projects, refused statues, blocked street namings. When the Department of Defense offered to place his badge in the Commanders of Historic Impact exhibit, he sent back a sealed envelope containing the silver tag worn by his mother on his jacket the day he was appointed Commander of Strategic Command. The man who carried it through his years in uniform never used it to command. He used it to remember a woman who fell to a bullet aimed not at rank, but at presence. The tag was transferred to the archives by personal request, without media. A single clerk received it, logging it in a notebook, not the digital system. She later said her hands trembled when she opened the box, not because of its material value, but because it proved something rare. Someone had held on to principle, even when they had the power to turn it into prestige. Not long after, a high school student joined a preservation internship at the archives. Assigned to sort uncatalogued materials, he came across the note. He didn't take a picture, didn't post online, but in his final paper, when asked, "What did you learn about memory and history?" he wrote only 8 words: "I want to be the one who didn't turn away." The paper didn't receive a high grade, but it was copied and included in the archive's internal briefing under the title, "What We Keep and Who For." The badge still lay in its cloth-lined box. No one proposed displaying it anymore. Not because it lacked worth, but because some things guide more powerfully from the shadows. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, after most staff had left the Federal Military Archives, a lone intern stayed in the basement where unexhibited items were kept. A senior law student from New Jersey. He had joined the fall program on justice and memory and public policy. No one asked him to work late, but since reading Marshall Carter's note, he volunteered every week, not for credit, but because something here felt unfinished. That day the lights were dimmer. He opened drawer R28 and lifted the faded box. The badge was smaller than he expected, but heavier, not in weight, but in meaning. As he touched it, something inside him shifted, like hearing a voice without sound. He held it up. The scratches caught the light softly. The eagle was still faintly visible. So was the engraving, U.S. Strategic Command. On the back, Carter, Internal U. He stood still. No cameras, no guide, just silence and the quiet weight of something real. He had never met Gloria Carter, but in that cold silver, he saw her, a woman left alone, a mother without help, a name not spoken on the news. What once felt like a poetic line now felt like a vow he couldn't drop. He placed the badge back, left the lid open, and stepped back. And in that soft light, he understood. Someone had died. but not silently. People only vanish when no one remembers why they stood. In his final assignment, when asked what he learned from an unexhibited item, he didn't quote theory. He wrote 8 words. Keep it, not to tell, but to remember. That afternoon, sunlight fell gently across the southern row of houses in Laverne, touching each faded rooftop like a quiet reminder. There were no police barricades, no crowds, no cameras lined up at the gate of number 94. The house still silent, unchanged since everything fell apart. The garden hadn't been replanted. Grass grew as it always had. The crack in the wooden fence remained, and the lavender in the back was nearly dry, with a few purple stems trembling in the cold early winter wind, trying to live through one more season, though no one was watching. Marshall Carter returned barefoot, stepping out of an unmarked car. He wore a gray shirt, his coat unbuttoned. No one opened the gate for him. He needed no one. This, he once believed, was the only place in the world where he could stand in loss without wearing command. He paused at the steps. His eyes didn't scan the house. They searched for one spot where something had once fallen by the gravel path. And from that moment, everything he knew about justice, strength, and silence had begun to shift. In his hand was a silver bracelet, not as bright as the day his mother first slipped it onto his wrist, but not worn down either. It held only the value she had passed on through how she kept it, not through words, not for display, not for power. A reminder, if no one else sees what's right, you must. He didn't linger. He didn't check who might be watching. He knew no one was, and if someone was, it didn't matter. This wasn't something to announce. It was something to do. At the right place, the right time, by the right person. He bent down and slipped the bracelet beneath the dry leaves and dust, not to hide it, not to bury it, but to return it to where it had once fallen. On a day a mother stood alone, and no one stood with her. The wind moved like breath, lavender petals swayed in rhythm, and in that open yard, unmarked by any memorial, a son left behind a goodbye, not in tears or promises, but by placing something in the exact right place, so no one else would pass over it blindly. He stood, brushed off his pants, his eyes narrowed in the sun, but they didn't redden. Marshall hadn't cried in years, not because it stopped hurting, but because he had learned to turn loss into a path, not for others to follow, but to prove that walking alone could still carry light. Before leaving, he looked back. Not at the fence, not the roof, but down, to the spot where his mother's hand had once touched the ground, when no strength remained to call for help. There were no flowers there, but a single blade of grass had pushed through the gravel, no taller than half a hand, small, unremarkable, but upright. He didn't touch it, just nodded, as if he'd finally received the answer he'd searched for all his life. Then he walked away. From that afternoon on, anyone passing through Laverne might notice a faint circle in the dust near the house, where time had etched the outline of something once held with loyalty. And those who looked closely would know it didn't mark a death, it marked the place where a society began to relearn how to stand. Not for greatness, but because someone once stood still when others turned away. There were no prayers that day, no tears, no strangers or lighting candles or leaving flowers. House number 94 remained an old home in a modest neighborhood, its paint peeling, the fence groaning under a soft touch. But there, where no one used to stop, where a mother once stood alone and died unnamed, something new had appeared. Not a monument, not a statue, not a plaque on a wall, just a small line carved deep beneath the inside edge of the weathered fence. Sometimes, one person standing still is enough to stop a wrong in time. No one knew who carved it. Some guessed a fence worker was hired on a quiet afternoon. Others thought a former archive intern had returned, leaving behind what needed to be said. No one claimed it, and that, somehow, made it feel more true. A right act doesn't need a name. A warning doesn't need to be shouted. Kids in the neighborhood started biking around the yard, not out of fear, but because something important happened there. A mother told her child that if they saw someone mistreated, not to look away, like people once did at that house. An old man passed by each morning, paused 2 minutes, didn't look in, didn't take photos, just placed his hand on the gate, as if balancing memory. And so, Gloria Carter, no holiday in her name, no portrait on television, no page in school books, became the beginning of something simple. The belief that if one person can stand still, then maybe the next won't turn away. Marshall never returned. He told his family there was no need to go back to keep a promise. He had kept it by living the way his mother taught. No shouting, no grand vows, no chasing light, just doing right when it matters. America didn't change overnight, but law students started asking new questions. Young officers began rejecting reports because they don't read true. Children learned to name injustices that adults had once hidden behind the word situation. It wasn't because of a new system, it was because of one old moment. Preserved, not forgotten, carved small but clear, right beneath the place where people step, close enough that if anyone pauses, bends down, and looks closely, they'll read it. This story has no holiday to honor it, no anthem to close it, just a small garden, an old wooden fence, and a silver bracelet returned to where it once fell. But maybe that's enough to remind us that justice doesn't always begin in a courtroom or with a stamped document. Sometimes it begins with one person, just one, who chooses not to turn away. We may not remember their name. History may write about someone else. But if, from now on, a child grows up without having to learn how to defend themselves for living with kindness, if one more person stops when they see something wrong, then those who fell will not be forgotten. And what is right, in the end, doesn't need someone to lead it. It just needs someone willing to stand.